and welcome to the next instalment of Clinker Chat. I am Clare Tubolets. I'm the CEO of SmartCrete CRC. I'm really excited to be here with you for another instalment of Clinker Chat. Before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping things. This is a Zoom webinar, so you have access to two functions as a participant. The first one is a chat box, which you can see down below. If you type some comments into the chat box, that will be available for everyone online to see, and it's a conversation that you can have with other participants. If you have a question for either myself or my guest today, Maggie, you can pop that into the Q&A section, and only Maggie and I will see that, and we plan to answer some questions at the end of our conversation. So today I'd really like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which both myself and Maggie are joining you today. So I am at Macquarie Park, which is the Durung Wurundjeri country, and Maggie is in Canberra, which is the Ngunnawal country. So I think it's really fascinating, given the sector that we're in, to reflect on the relationship that our First Nations people had to the land, and the lessons that we can learn as infrastructure designers and owners and engineers, how we can learn from that relationship with land in terms of how we create infrastructure which sits really comfortably in place. So I'm very pleased to acknowledge those traditional owners today. So I'm very pleased to introduce Maggie Thompson, who's joining me today from the Cement Industry Federation. Hi, Maggie. Thanks for joining me. And today we're going to be talking about our shared Decarbonisation Pathways report. But in fact, we're going to get very deep and technical. So I thought it might make sense for us, Maggie, just to start, first of all, quite high level, and talk about, I guess, first of all, our shared entry into this sector, and then a little bit more about the science behind, what is cement. But so, Maggie, you've come from the agriculture sector. I guess my first question is, how did you get here? How did you get into cement?
So I spent 30 years actually in the agricultural sector, working across multiple facets from policy to marketing to trade and program management of R&D. And through that, I think you develop a skill base that allows you to be able to move to different subject matters. And I was always a commodity specialist. And so or a product specialist, I should say. And so when I was working on climate-based issues around the agricultural sector, it was noted in other sectors, and that's how it fell into the role at the Cement Industry Federation.
I think, there are real parallels, aren't there, from that agricultural space in terms of the decarbonisation pathways, and many of the same conversations are being had across many different sectors. I know I've seen that as well, also coming from the agriculture sector. Many of the conversations that we were having in my last CRC, which was the Food Agility CRC, around things like how do we measure carbon, how do we track, scope 3 emissions across the supply chain, how do we create, for us it was circular food economies, and so here it's, how do we create circular infrastructure environments. There are so many transferable themes and topics across many different sectors.
Absolutely. And, in the, going back to the real beginnings of when carbon pricing was starting to be developed as a policy, it was really important to look at all the different sectors and to see what the impact would be around competitiveness. And that was a key focus of the work that I did. And so looking at how we're going to decarbonise into the cement industry, there are actually a lot of similarities between the two sectors. But of course, cement is an industrial process, and that's where it really does differ until you get into the processing of the actual agricultural commodities.
Which you've very nicely gone into the first question that I wanted to ask you, which is around, what is cement? Can we start right at the beginning, just so that, for people that are joining us online today that might not be from our sector, give them a really nice basis, because we're about to go quite technical.
I think that's really important. This is going to be a deep dive into decarbonisation. So as the CEO of the Cement Industry Federation, we represent Australia's cement integrated manufacturers. So that means that they produce both clinker and cement at the same plant. And I'll go into what is clinker, what is cement, because I think it's really important. we'll do that very quickly. I do have a graphic that just demonstrates geographically where we're situated around Australia. And as you can see, there's really only 5 plants in Australia. There are 3,500 kilns across the world. So you can see that we're just a really small part of a very important sector. And if you, next time when you're driving home, just have a look at how much concrete you will see all around you. Not just the roads, the bridges, the buildings, the water infrastructure, the airport. Without cement or concrete, we would not have the advanced standard of living that we have today. But let's go back into what is cement, and if we could flick over to that slide very quickly. It's just like making a cake. So you get out your bowl, and instead of popping in your flour, you're going to pop in some limestone. It's going to have been crushed, but it hasn't actually been cooked at all. And you're going to add some sand and some other materials, and you're going to preheat the oven and pop it into the precalciner, which is that long tube that you can see on the left-hand side. And then instead of putting it into the oven at 180 degrees, you've got to put it into a kiln at over 1400 degrees Celsius. It's so hot that that limestone, which was the replacement for the flour in the cake, is so hot that it actually turns into a liquid. And what pops out the other end is this really small pellet called clinker. And it's a manufactured stone, and it's grey because of the colour of the limestone. And what pops out then is that it needs this very hot cake, which is your clinker. It needs to be crushed, so it then goes into the third stage of production, where it gets grinded, or ground I should say, and then you can add some more limestone if you need to, and gypsum, and that limestone that's added hasn't been cooked. So you can actually put some more limestone or other products, which we'll talk about later, into the product. So when you go into Bunnings and buy your bag of cement, that's what the process has been to actually get there. It's quite simple.
Yeah, fascinating. And we're talking today about decarbonisation, and we're about to get into the roadmap that we've collaborated on. But what's the emissions profile of the sector? Where does the carbon come from?
Yeah, let's find that slide if we can, which is a very simplistic slide. So yeah, there we go. So we have quite a unique profile compared to most other products. Most other products, the CO2 mainly revolves around energy. And as you can see, our heat fuels, which heat the oven, heat the kiln, are usually coal or gas, or as we decarbonise, we're increasing the number of waste fuels, and it's called co-processing, in that you can actually use that waste as an energy source and reduce your profile significantly. But as you can see there, that's only 30% of our profile. And we have what's called process emissions. So when you actually cook the limestone, it releases CO2 to create the clinker, and that is 60% of our emissions profile. And that is because we're making clinker. And so we've got to look at strategies all along the value chain on how we can actually use less clinker or create alternatives to be able to decarbonise into the future. There's a little bit on the end there, Claire. You'll see that there's another little 10%, and that's important. That is our electricity usage.
Right.
And that is called indirect emissions. So our Scope 1 emissions are our process emissions and our heat fuels, and you can have clinker substitution in cement. And then our Scope 2 emissions, indirect emissions, are electricity. So we need to ensure that we try to use green purchase agreements as much as possible.
Right. And actually, it's a really interesting question there. You mentioned the Scope 3 emissions, and, I guess that's really considering the supply chain. And a little bit earlier, you talked about the fact that Australia is really a a cement drop in the ocean, and it's obviously a global supply chain. So how much do we need to be thinking about that global context when we're taking into account, all of the different, carbon profiles for the sector?
Yeah, so just a few fast facts. So in terms of cement and concrete, in terms of from a global perspective, it can be up to 8%, between 6 and 8% of emissions, total emissions in the international inventory. In Australia, it's much smaller. It's about 1%. And it's much smaller because it's developing countries that are really having this great uptake. Another really interesting fast fact, Claire, is that nearly 70% of cement production actually occurs in China. So it's really important that China works out the pathways to decarbonise, and they are. They're doing some magnificent R&D, and that is being shared, and so are the Europeans, the Canadians and the Americans, and we are doing a lot of stuff back here as well. But we are part of the Global Cement and Concrete Association, which allows us to be able to share different R&D projects and pilot projects that are happening across the world. And that creates some really great opportunities into the future with SmartCrete in trying to link into those international projects so that we can even not just do that basic R&D, but look at what sort of pilots we might be able to bring back home.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you've nicely captured this in that discussion around, how does the concrete process, the cement manufacturing process work? But something that I keep hearing in my own discoveries coming to this sector are how difficult it is for this sector to really think about a decarbonisation pathway. And I think the thing that I hear a lot is, hard to abate. Do you have some thoughts on why this sector is classified as hard to abate?
It's really quite simple. It's because of that the process emissions, and other sectors don't have such a high profile that includes such a high amount of process emissions. It is difficult to abate, but it can be achieved, and it becomes a lot simpler the more you create a life cycle analysis and look through the whole value chain. To make it happen is possible. You just need to join hands, because remember, we supply a product. At the end of the day, it turns into a building. And unless those that demand the product are willing to accept or are willing to adopt or are keen to decarbonise their building infrastructure or their road infrastructure or their bridge infrastructure, it's not going to happen. We can supply lower carbon cements by replacing clinker with supplementary materials such as slag, I love that word, which is a waste product from the steel industry, or fly ash, which is a waste product from coal power stations, or even increase the amount of limestone in the product, without changing significantly the strength or durability of the product. And if we want to get that adoption, there's lots of pathways. It can be through procurement, government procurement, for instance, and it also can be in terms of working closely with those that are going to use the product and demonstrating that they can use these lower carbon products without affecting the strength or the durability of the build. And there's a whole lot of pathways which we can get into by looking at what's called the VDZ report.
Yes, our decarbonisation report. But before we move on from that, reflecting on my own experience in the agriculture sector, and I think you've probably had some similar experiences, these, classifications of kind of hard to abate or almost, I might be going too far saying this, but almost like a vilification of the people that work in the sector, and this idea that maybe we're not hugely focused on sustainability. This is what I saw in agriculture. You know, it's quite easy to say, oh, you know, farmers only care about their profits. They only, you know, and you kind of polarize and you say, well, we've got profitability on one hand and then environmental sustainability on the other hand, as though they're polar opposites rather than being something that kind of comes together. And I'm thinking about it. So a direct experience I had recently. I was really lucky to be able to talk at the National Farmers Federation conference where they were having huge discussions about, you know, how do we approach some of the carbon issues for the sector and how do we become quite sustainable. And it had come off the back of quite a lot of media around, you know, oh, you know, the sector doesn't really care and this kind of sentiment. And so I hopped up on stage and said, you know, as a child of the 80s and, you know, growing up in the 90s, I watched quite a lot of Captain Planet. And Captain Planet has this, you know, really ridiculous polarizing view where all of the environmentalists are the good guys and the bad guys all have these, you know, they just want to destroy the environment for fun, you know, and it's just this. It's this ridiculous universe where yeah, you've got the environmental goodies on one side and the big bad business on the other side. And, you know, I was saying to the National Farmers Federation, that kind of mindset is so damaging because really any farmer, and, you know, I'm sure it's exactly the same in cement and concrete, any processor who is not also thinking about sustainability is not going to be able to hold on to their profitability. And so it really goes hand in hand. And I imagine the same is, you know, true here in the cement industry as well. We have people that are really passionate about creating a very sustainable sector. And so that kind of polarizing or, you know, vilification of the sector, it doesn't help. You know, we don't get to showcase these amazing examples of very sustainable products being released.
Yeah, I love that Captain Planet example. I think that's a beauty. And I can remember being in a meeting with a significant federal politician, and he was talking about our sector, or not our sector, he was talking about industrialized processes, and he was calling them big polluters and dirty polluters. And we actually pulled him up on it. And he said, no, I never said that. I've called you a big polluter. I've called you a dirty polluter, but I've never called you a big dirty polluter. And I thought, oh, this is ridiculous. But you know what? He came from Labor and he realised that we represent a really significant part of Australia's workforce. And he was actually, it's quite insulting to call that to your employees, which are unionised. And at the end of the day, when you really look at the value chain and how we will decarbonise by 2050, it's about joining hands and working together.
Absolutely.
And Labor, the coalition, maybe the Greens are working towards it, but realise that if we actually try to become enablers, we can get there quicker. And
Absolutely.
we could even get to even negative emissions if we counted in some of our recarbonation processes.
Which is a fascinating topic that I'm sure we could spend a whole Clinker chat talking about. I'm really enjoying learning about recarbonation. So let's get to the Decarbonisation Pathways report, which is obviously the reason why we're here today. So it was a partnership between CIF, between CCAA, the SmartCrete CRC, and another CRC called Race for 2030, which is focused on improving our electrician system, our electrical supply chain. So I guess the question is, how did it start? You know, this is quite new for me as well. So what were the objectives of the project and how did that group first come together to decide what to do?
Yeah, so how did it start? We had been trying to advocate how we could reduce our Scope 1 emissions and how we could work with government in trying to do so. I think I've got a slide there and I'm just going to go into technical again. Yeah, and so you can see on the side, you know, that's our emissions profile. And this is what we can do to try to reduce our emissions. And it's really hard to even tell that story. So as you can see up the top, you've got your grid decarbonisation, so that's your electricity. Then we're looking at what we can do in terms of heat, so how we can cook our clinker or make cement. and using alternative fuels and the opportunities. Like, we're still in early days. We know that at least 10% green hydrogen could be used. We think it could be much higher. It may even be that part of the kiln could be electrified. It's early days in terms of R&D there. Then, in terms of lowering the clinker factor with limestone alternatives or with using other types of SCMs, recarbonation, where, cement acts like a big fat tree in that it actually takes back the CO2 over time, which is unbelievable. And that can be, we've got in this VDZ report, it could be around 20%, but it could be even higher. And then there's carbon capture and storage, which is the really important way that we'll decarbonise, but it's still probably at least 10 years away. But trying to tell that story is not easy. And so your predecessor and I, Warren South, got together and thought, how can we put this together into a framework so that we can tell the story in an easier fashion, and that it links into global roadmaps, the global roadmap that has now been created, but is about our sector and what we can do from an Australian perspective. And so that's how the project started. And we spoke to government. So government did another project side by side this, because it's quite expensive to do a full decarbonisation report. And so that assisted in trying to bring the cost down. And then Warren was really good at finding Race CRC to join hands with us. And we were trying to work out, well, then who do we get to do it? And we wanted to have an international expert that had a really deep understanding about the cement and concrete sector. And you can't go past VDZ. And so we approached, we went through a lot of iterations in making sure that we were going to get the outcomes that we needed for both the government to inform what was its lower emissions technology statement each year, but this report has longevity, and we would like to make sure that we're measuring against it every few years, and that we're updating it as other technologies may come on board, or that we can see there are more priority projects that we need to do.
Right. Yes. And so the report at the moment identifies 8 pathways. So I wonder if we could just go through those 8 pathways, which will potentially lead us to that 100% decarbonisation of the sector. I'll pop up another slide. And all of this is available in the Decarbonisation Pathways report, and there's both a long version and a short version, and we'll link to both of those when we share the recording of this webinar. But Maggie, can you take me through this? How does this relate to the table that you just showed us, and what do these pathways mean?
Yeah, so Scope 1 emissions are what are used by the government to measure how we're going to reduce our emissions. And as we could see, they're quite limited. It's around using alternative fuels or trying to lower the clinker factor. We can look at the electricity grid, but if you look much further down the actual value chain, right up to the end consumer, there's a whole lot of pathways that you can use to decarbonise the clinker that's in cement, that's in concrete, that's in the building, that's in the road. And so without going through each individual pathway, because there's other webinars that we could, it takes a good hour to go through each particular pathway. But what you can see is that when you get to concrete, there's innovation happening right across the board in making sure that you're not wasting concrete when you're at the build. There's even a project which has been commercialised where they inject CO2 into the concrete. And the further you go along the built environment, you can see that you can innovate through the design. Like, you just think about you putting a column up in a building. Does it have to be a solid structure? Could it actually be more like a tunnel, a funnel that you don't have to use as much. So it's being smart and being able to use less of the actual product in particular circumstances. And then at the end of the day, we can supply and supply and supply lower carbon products. We've got a whole lot of brands that are out there, but if the demand isn't there, things won't change. And so that comes into the designers, it comes through the specifiers, the procurers, it comes through the developers, it comes to the actual builders. And there's a really good seminar that I went to this week with Jason Chandler, and he talked about this guy who was just trialing a lower carbon product from Boral. And he found that it was really difficult to pump the lower carbon product compared to what he was used to. And so they actually joined hands and they looked at how they could find a way to be able to manage that product better. And they did. And so, you know, I think his name was Harvey, if you're there, Jason, I think it was Harvey, then found a way to be able to utilise that product. So if you join hands, and it really needs to start right now, which is happening, and government procurement is a really good lead. And I think that will make a significant difference in the first instance. But we know that there's many companies such as Lendlease, for example, who are really looking at how they can look at decarbonising their buildings as well, and looking at it through an embodied carbon lens.
Yes, which is, it's critical. So I guess, you know, the big question that I have in going through the Decarbonisation Pathways report is, how feasible is this right now? You know, how much of this can be based on existing technologies, existing processes, and how much new innovation do we need? Do you have a sense of whether or not we can implement this right now?
Well, there's a lot that we can do now, and that's why going through the levers is really useful. But to summarise, there's a lot of regulation with good reason around the sector, from building codes right down to the specification of the materials. And with cement and concrete, there are specific regulations or standards, and some of those standards haven't been reviewed for a very long time. The cement regs or standards, which, you know, the majority of material that's supplied today is what's called general purpose cement. Hasn't been reviewed for over 10 years.
Right.
And that is something that we know needs to happen, because that could mean that we could increase the amount of SCMs. But even in the regulations or standards as they are now, we can really try to adopt higher limestone cements, as you know, all right through in trying to increase the amount of SCMs, that are supplementary cementitious materials, that are in the product. And in the US, they had a great campaign between the supply and the demand side of the value chain, and there has been uptake in nearly every state in the US. And why can't we do that here?
Absolutely. And to do a shameless plug for SmartCrete here, you know, thinking about what are the new innovations that might come out to help support this supply chain. SmartCrete has 3 research programs. So I think it's highly aligned to what you were just talking about there, Margie, because number 1 is really talking about the sustainability of the concrete mix itself. And so how can we either test and develop new supplementary cementitious materials, or, you know, continue to work with, you know, understanding the mixes for SCMs that are currently available. Number 2 is looking at that engineered solution. So, you know, exactly what you were talking there in terms of can we actually engineer our structures so that they need less concrete, which would also mean, you know, less carbon overall. And then then number 3 is about asset management, because it's also recognizing in terms of that embodied carbon discussion and the life cycle of these products, if we can extend the life cycle and extend the durability of our concrete infrastructure, that also is going to lead to a lower embodied carbon profile over time. So SmartCrete's really excited to be working across this Decarbonisation Pathways report, the various pathways that have been identified to create some of the innovations that might help move us from here to there. And just thinking about that, I think there's very clear parts of this pathway that talk directly to what SmartCrete is trying to achieve. But I can see actually that many members of the supply chain fit into different pathways here. And maybe this is a real Dorothy Dixer question, but how critical do you think it is that we get that full supply chain collaboration and participation in this?
Look, it's absolutely critical. And there's a group called MECLA that has been meeting now, I think we must be coming up to 12 months. And
I think just past 12 months. I think they had a birthday about 2-3 weeks ago.
There you go.
Yeah.
And it's been absolutely brilliant at having these formal conversations and building up ideas and then working out how you can go to next steps. And it just demonstrates by drawing the value chain together what you can do. And a good example is around fly ash. And there's a lot of lower grade fly ash that is available. It's called bottom ash. It gets worse. We've got slag and bottom ash. And anyway.
I love it.
And there's a project that the New South Wales government is now considering in looking at how you could actually maybe treat that product so that we would have enough fly ash that would then go on for a much longer period of time than the fly ash that will be available. Because remember, these coal power stations are going to close. And so we won't have fly ash available either domestically or internationally over time. And so finding other alternatives will be critical. And bottom ash is something that may become relevant in time,
Fascinating. Yeah. And so I guess all those innovations around how do we refine that product? How do we make sure it's fit for purpose? That's going to be fascinating. So switching to your world, and the work that you do on the Hill in Canberra, what are you seeing from a policy context and from a government perspective in terms of supporting this decarbonisation pathway?
Yeah, well, it's early days with the new government. However, we're just starting our meetings now with the new parliament, and it is a very supportive environment. The safeguard mechanism is the critical tool that's being used at the moment, and it will need to go further. It's too blunt an instrument. As you can see, it only attaches itself to scope 1. And unless you look at that full life cycle, you don't actually decarbonise. There's also another part in the VDZ report that talks about trade exposure. And Australia's in a pretty unique position in that over 40% of the product is actually imported. So unless you actually address the emissions from that imported product, which is usually called carbon leakage in policy terms, you could end up with a perverse situation in that you will remove your domestic manufacturing, move it internationally where you're not facing a carbon price. And so unless we address that issue up front, even the safeguard mechanism will be a blunt tool. But the number of programs that the government has the ability to influence through the value chain is quite significant, and procurement is a really prime example.
I think that's such a great example of why this is such a delicate issue that needs to be very carefully managed, because, I think that's a really interesting insight that if we were to say, tax carbon here in Australia, we would make ourselves globally uncompetitive. And as you say, then we potentially reduce our market here in Australia only to bring in that carbon the imported cement that we're bringing from overseas. So just such an interesting thing that needs to be very carefully considered as we start to think about how we support the sector to move towards decarbonisation.
Yeah, and it's not trying to run away from the importance of decarbonising. And my members, which are Adbri, Boral and Cement Australia, understand the need to decarbonise as quickly as possible. When you're being called difficult abate, is not saying that we're walking away from this. It means that we need to involve the full value chain, and you can only decarbonise based on the technologies that are available. 60% of our emissions relate to CCUS unless other new technologies come into play. So this is from looking through a lens of scope 1. And so, drawing through those investment programs are really important so that we can focus on those other levers, which we can do now, and look at that full life cycle. And also, in terms of what you call your trade competitiveness, if we are able to manage that upfront, which is what Europe is looking at now through what's called the CBAM, I think that you end up with a really strong position, because if your scope 3 emissions or your imported emissions are being treated exactly the same, then the incentive to be able to decarbonise increases domestically, because you're not being your competitiveness is not being threatened.
Yeah, absolutely. I can see that there are questions coming in hot and fast on the Q&A line, and I have 2 more for you. So we better get through them quickly so that we can stay to time. I guess thinking about discussing this roadmap, it's a really fantastic document, and I highly recommend everyone watching, if you haven't already, please do read through it. It's very consumable. It's very easy to read. We have the document now. We have the roadmap. What's next?
Well, it's only the start of the journey, and it isn't a journey that's just started today. We've been decarbonising our product for many years, and a great example is around alternative fuels. We are already way above the world average in that I think we're getting close to 20% using alternative fuels, and we have our companies have targets which are well into the 40s, over 40%. By 2030. And if you look at those numbers and compare that to what even the global cement and concrete roadmap are, we're really well down that journey. But in terms of what we can do now versus what we need to do into the future is where we've got to really join those hands together along that value chain to really support that deep decarbonisation. And it can happen quite quickly if the demand for those lower carbon products comes into play very quickly.
Yes, absolutely. So my final question before we jump into the questions that are coming through on the Q&A line is, what's your vision for the future of the cement industry, Margie?
Oh, it has a really bright, strong future. I really love working within the sector. We're so fortunate that with the passion and drive across our membership in wanting to decarbonise. And as you know, meeting across that value chain, forming that trust and the relationship and demonstrating that lower carbon products are feasible, that I think we have a really bright future, and it will be well beyond, we'll be probably long gone, Claire, by 2050, but I'm really confident that we are going to get there by 2050, if not before.
Fantastic. I like to hear it. I agree. 2050 is a horizon that's a bit too far. So I'd like to hear it. Okay, so we have quite a few questions coming through. Thank you everyone for submitting a few extra thoughts. First one I'll say is not a question, it's a comment from Jason Chandler. He said, thanks for the shout out, and Howie is the
Howie.
Thank you, Jason. So Karen Gomez, question is, Westpac has released its net zero targets for 2030. Cement is one of the industries covered with a 25% reduction from 2018-19 baseline. What do financial institution targets mean for the sector, and can that be reached? A fantastic question. Thanks, Karen.
Karen, thank you very much for your question. Our targets, as an industry association, our job is to really be able to promote what the pathways are to decarbonise. The targets are actually set by the member companies, and their targets reflect what the technologies they can use between now and 2030 and 2050 on how they'll be able to decarbonise. Financial instruments are a great incentive because they incentivise not just the manufacturers but the whole value chain in looking at the way that they manage. It may be a financial service, it may be a product, in how they produce that service or product. And so having targets by financial institutions around different products, they need to be working with the actual value chain itself. You can't sit in a corner and say for a particular sector to be X without, one, understanding its value chain, and two, connecting into it. And I'm sure that Westpac, as other financial services are doing that, and we're talking to them directly as well as an industry association. So thank you, Karen, for your question. It's a really important one, and I think that it is important, but the linkages are just as important as well.
I feel like that's a really nice shout out to any of the financiers out there. Please come and talk to Margie. So we've got two questions from Mehdi Rabati. Number one, do you see momentum in the uptake of unconventional approaches such as Portland, limestone and carbon capture?
Yeah, I don't actually see them, Mehdi, as unconventional. I think they're quite conventional. They're just their TRL levels are at different stages. In terms of higher limestone cements, we can produce those today. We are producing those today. There are specifiers that are very comfortable with using higher limestone cements. The US has demonstrated that within a 24-month period, they have been able to do a life change in terms of the increase in limestone-based cements. When it means moving into SCMs and increasing the amount of other SCMs into the product, yes. And there's also the opportunities, which are low on the TRLs, but the technological readiness will increase as they start to go through these pilot phases and demo phases. For example, clay-based cements, or which is sometimes being branded as C3. Carbon capture, usage and storage. There's a project that's being funded at the moment by the HILT CRC, and we're working with them and the CSIRO in evaluating from a bottoms-up approach. So looking at each individual cement and lime facility in Australia, and then looking what are the type of technologies that can be used to capture the CO2, and Calyx is a great example of that. And then looking at whether, based on their geographic location, they're close to what is a sink point, or can it be transport efficiently to that sink point? Is it a pipeline? Does it involve shipping? And what the potential cost could be. That is touched on in the VDZ report, Mandy, so it's worth having a look there. And you'll see that we've even tried to look at what costings, we've looked at costing it out. It's not cost competitive at the moment, but as we know with anything, as time goes on, things change, and the number of sink points are likely to increase as well as being able to use the CO2 and it can be used in terms of mineralisation. It may be used for other purposes that is yet to be found. And so, yes, it's got a low TRL level, but the amount of R&D and piloting that is happening is increasing at a very fast rate globally. Somebody just told me the number of projects that are about to be underway in terms of piloting CCUS. It's like we're talking about 20 something, like it's not one or two, which is what we're talking about at the moment. And we hope that we'll be part of that too. And our members have received government grants to be able to trial different technologies in the last 6 months. So watch this space, Mindy, it's going to change.
Watch this space. Fantastic. And so your second question there, Maggie, is that you are unable to find a list of SmartCrete projects. And that's actually a really fantastic opportunity for me to tell you that as of yesterday, we have a brand new website. And following the Atlassian principles of move fast and, fix in retrospect, it's not quite ready with the list of projects. So check back in with us in the next couple of days. We have a pipeline of 16 active projects that we're very excited about across a range of different topic areas in those three research areas that I mentioned before. So I hope everyone is enjoying our new aesthetic and all of the information behind that is coming in the next couple of days. So a question here from our very own SmartCrete board member, Stephen Harmer. Margie, what would you see as quick wins available to meet the decarbonisation pathway?
Read the VDZ report, Stephen, which I'm sure he has.
I think he knows it intimately.
And I have presented it to him in detail. So I know he's very close to the project. There are numerous early wins. If you look down on scope 1, you can see that our alternative fuels. So getting right behind co-processing, and that means not changing the regulations, but working with the communities and local governments, state governments, so that the uptake of new materials that can be, or new waste materials can be used at site is important. It's so good to be able to say to you today, Claire, that unlike an incinerator, when you co-process waste into a cement kiln, it actually becomes part of the product.
Right.
And so it's a really great way to be able to utilize the energy from that waste and then embody it into the product. And so it becomes like a circular economy.
Brilliant.
Yeah. Other quick wins, look at the electricity grid, Stephen. We have a government that has a pathway to be able to try to bring through a renewable grid as quickly as possible. So that will start looking at our scope 2. Scope 3, I say look at trade exposure. That's an early win in trying to really drive through decarbonisation domestically. And if you run through the value chain and you were saying, where's that quick win? How are we going to bring everybody together to join hands to decarbonise as quickly? Karen is one of those players in being part of financial services. But where is the government? Why do we not have procurement programs that are seeking out lower carbon products? When, it's the government's target that we're trying to meet. And I just think that is really on the cusp as well. And we'll see that happen soon.
Absolutely. And I can report really fantastic engagement with some of our state government infrastructure owners in the SmartCrete program. So really, really good to see that happening at that level. So Karen, again, thank you. Next one is a suggestion rather than a question. To help lift alternative fuels from 17%, the cement industry could look at the gate fees it charges for alternative fuels into their kilns. These are the most expensive gate fees for alternative fuels compared to other waste options, is it? It may be attractive, it may attract more fuel with lower gate fees. And the final one from Karen is, and she said, thank you so much for your responses, Maggie. With only 5 kilns in Australia, what are the barriers to doing the US case study in higher limestone content?
Yeah, so I don't necessarily see the parallel between the two, because what we're trying to do is replace clinker with uh, lower carbonized products. So if you do higher limestone cements, you don't need as much clinker. However, the population is going to grow, and with that, the need to be able to consume concrete is likely to increase at a similar pace. And so it's very unlikely, if you see the VDZ report, that we would lose our kilns that we have today. But we are trying to replace clinker with other product to decarbonise until we get to that technology flip where we get to CCUS, and that changes the profile again. But hopefully there'll be other technologies that come into play as well. But I love the question, why aren't we doing what's happening in the US in terms of higher limestone cements? We are. And I say watch this space.
Fantastic. Well, Margie, thank you so much. That has been such a fantastic dive into the Decarbonisation Pathways report and the position that Australia is currently in with our cement industry. I have really personally enjoyed that. Thank you to everyone on the line who joined us today, and those of you who are watching this as a recording later on. This is a monthly series, so Clinker Chat will be back next month on the last Friday of the month. And next month, we're going to be diving into some of the research projects that SmartCrete is running. So please stay tuned. But thank you so much again for your time, Margie. It's been really great chatting to you.
Oh, thank you very much, Claire, and a big shout out to Howie as well.
Thanks.
Okay, see you.
Bye.